So, to start off with this assignment, I decided to do some research on the Gale and Context database about the Philippine American War. And what I found was that the war was basically conflict between the people of the Philippines and the American people because the American people wanted to impose their ideals onto the people of the Philippines. So, they wanted to impose American democracy. Um, they wanted to impose Christianity. They wanted to impose all these different things on the people of the Philippines, and the people of the Philippines didn't want that. They wanted independence because this Philippine American War was right after the Spanish American War, and in the Spanish War, the Spanish people ceded the Philippines to the United States. So the people of the Philippines went from Spanish rule to American rule, when in reality they just wanted independence. They didn't want to be a part of any of this. So during the war, it was tough for the people of the Philippines because the American people had more money, more resources, they had more stronger military, and the people of the Philippines had to use very aggressive tactics, including guerrilla warfare. So they ambushed, sabotaged, they raided the American people, and it was working at first, but as time went on, I think just the amount of casualties and just the strength of the American military kind of forced the Filipino people to retreat. Once the president of the Philippines was captured by the American people, he surrendered. And then around that time, the next year, that was considered the official end to the war. When Miguel Marvar, which was kind of the leader of the revolution in the Philippines, he surrendered officially in 1902, and that was considered the end of the war. But the people of the Philippines didn't actually get their independence until after World War II, which was in the 1940s, 1950s ish. And I thought that was pretty interesting because, I mean, at least they had freedom from, they didn't have war for those years. But I think it's pretty interesting how, even after they surrendered from the American people and there was really nobody there to control them, they still didn't have their full independence because the US government continued increasing autonomy in the following decades. So even after, surrendering, they still were under control. And there are also many Filipino casualties. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos died in the war, while only a few thousand Americans passed due to the war. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So to get into the discussion boards, I put them on this little notepad here because I didn't want to expose my classmates' information since I'm posting this on YouTube. So the first classmate that I decided to use was Ella. She focused on consideration number one, and she talked about how the McKinley interview was a primary source because it came directly from McKinley, and he had power at the time to influence how the American expansion was presented in the Philippines. I like how she said this because it it's kind of a biased piece of media, I would say, because of course the American president is going to tell people, hey, this is going to benefit the American people. This is going to, be good for us. And, of course, it's going to present it in a positive light and it's going to seem like a good thing. When in reality, if you were to ask the people of the Philippines or the Filipino president the same thing, of course they would have a different answer and a different perspective because they're the ones being treaded on. She continues to say, since McKinley had power at the time to highlight the benefits of American expansion, he could present it in a positive light. And this creates a bias because he did not represent the opinions of Filipinos who will be affected by his decisions. And I agree with her. This is what I talked about in my discussion post as well. I really focus on the fact that the interview was biased towards, McKinley's perspective, his agenda, and his idea of what this expansion would do for the American people and the people of the Philippines. When in reality, he didn't include the Filipino perspective. He didn't include the fact that the Filipinos wanted independence and they resisted, the US government's imperialism on their country. He did not include that perspective, and it kind of shows that he was a little biased in what he was saying. So the second discussion board post I decided to include is my classmate Avery. She focused on consideration number two, and she talked about, well, for context, consideration number two is the context of the information. So world events happening at the time, technology at the time, basically society at the time, and how advanced society was, and how that impacts how the information is presented. So she says that the McKinley interview was in 1903, which is a few years after the Spanish American War, where the United States had just taken control of the Philippines. And at that time, there was a lot of back and forth about whether the U.S. should be involved in, foreign affairs. Technology back then was mostly newspapers and speeches, so interviews was basically the only reason, the only way, one of the only ways McKinley could explain his decisions to the public. And she says that this source is basically him justifying why he decided to keep the Philippines and how he thought that the US should be a positive influence to them. She says she thinks it's interesting because you can really see that he believed he was doing the right thing, and it shows how different people thought about America's role in the world back then. I like how she said this because she's basically talking about how McKinley justified his imperialism, used religion, he kind of used trial and error. If you go to his interview, he talks about kind of his deductive process and how he thought about whether or not he should keep the Philippines. At first, he says he didn't really want them, but he believes that it was a gift from God, and he knew that one, he couldn't give them back to Spain because it'd be cowardly. He couldn't give them to France and Germany because those were their, America's rivals at the time. And he believed he couldn't leave the Filipino people to themselves to govern themselves because he believed that they would eventually have anarchy and they would basically have a civil war within their own country and they wouldn't be able to, you know, be able to govern themselves. So he kind of thinks he took it upon himself and the American people took it upon themselves to protect the Philippines and to civilize them, to educate them, to introduce them to Christianity and God. And I thought that it was pretty interesting how he justified his ways in in such a manner. I mean, he talks about he couldn't give them to this country. He couldn't give it to this country. They can't govern themselves, so we're the only ones left. Is basically his thought process, which I thought was pretty interesting. And Avery did a really good job talking about that. So finally, we have the Anti-Imperialist League, excuse me, and they're basically saying in this little excerpt, they're basically saying that the American government is corrupt and that imperialism is wrong and that the United States has always, always, always said, people are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They talk about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and all these things, the founding principles of America, which is essentially freedom, the ability to do what you want to do when you want to do it. And the League is basically saying that the American people are oppressing the people of the Philippines. We're taking away their choice and their freedom and their ability to govern themselves. You know, they also talk about how the government derives its powers from the consent of the governed, and many people were unhappy with what the American government was doing to the Philippines or what the American military was doing to the Philippines. And the fact that the American people said, hey, we don't want this, the people of the Philippines and the Philippine government said, hey, we don't want this. It's really just the American government saying, oh, yeah, this is the best way. This is, the great thing that we're going to do. And most people didn't agree with them. And the League is basically trying to say, hey, this isn't right. This isn't right. The founding principles of America, the first settlers, they left Europe to escape oppression and to be able to have the freedom to do what they like, the freedom of religion, the freedom of all these different things. And America is basically, now that America has their freedom, they're trying to take away another country's freedom. That's basically their perspective of the League here. But they don't blame the people who are fighting in the war. They're just condemning the administration, they're condemning the government. They say that they they admire the bravery of the soldiers, the sailors, the people fighting in the war. They admire them. They just don't agree with the American government and what they're trying to do to the Philippines, which I kind of agree with them. I mean, the people of the Philippines have the right to govern themselves if they want to. And the American people have no right to say, no, you need to learn our ways. You need to learn how we have democracy and how we, you know, manage our religion and these different things. But to talk about the vantage point of, McKinley's perspective in the American expansionism, as a country, it seems like the right thing to do is to expand your territory, to have as much land as possible, to have as much resources as possible. Now, McKinley doesn't necessarily say, hey, we want the Philippines because of the resources. He believes that it is his God given duty to go to the Philippines and educate them, to civilize them, to introduce them to Christianity and all these different concepts. He believes that this is part of his duty as the president. And he also put the Philippines on the map of the United States. He wanted the Philippines to be a part of America, which, I mean, it's admirable. It's definitely ambitious. And I would like to say he had good intentions. Um, but it's kind of tough to side with McKinley in this expansionism and imperialism because all I can think about personally is the perspective of the Philippines. They went from Spanish rule and they saw the Spanish being defeated and they're thinking, oh, the Spanish people, that maybe they'll leave us alone after they get defeated in the war. So they start helping the American people fight against the Spanish. And then when the Spanish lose, the American people say, okay, we're going to take you next. It's tough. I mean, the people of the Philippines, they literally just want independence. And I think once you read both sides, you read up on the war, it's kind of hard to take the perspective or to side with McKinley, at least in my opinion, because you can see that the Filipino people literally just want independence. And eventually they got it. So great.